spaces for women and girls is ongoing. You'll recall last year Sal Grover, the founder of women-only social networking app Giggle, was found by a court to have indirectly discriminated against transgender woman Roxanne Tickle by blocking her from joining the app. In that case, the judge ruled sex is changeable and not necessarily binary. So biological men can join a women's site. Surely not. Thankfully, Grover launched an appeal which is playing out in the federal court as we speak. Let's bring in Liberal Senator for Tasmania, Claire Chandler, who's long advocated for common sense on these issues. Good to talk to you again, Claire. Some interesting arguments being put in this appeal, including by the Lesbian Action Group, saying, hang on, these sex discrimination laws are not supposed to allow boys to turn up in girls' dormitories and the like.
Well, that's exactly right, Chris, and I think the involvement of these other groups in the Tickle versus Giggle case shows just how important this case is going to be in determining whether women and girls do have the right to their own spaces and services and sports, as I have advocated for many years they should, and I know Sal has as well. So it's going to be an incredibly important case. And, you know, I think it just goes to show that, you know, the state of women and girls' rights in Australia is seriously under question here. I mean, we can't say that the Sex Discrimination Act is doing what it should be doing, which is protecting the rights of women and girls, when a woman like Sal Grover gets dragged through the courts and dragged through a legal process just because she wanted to offer a single-sex space for women and girls, which in this case was an online space, being her app.
Yeah, and look, that's bad enough, because women and girls should be able to have that online space to share discussions between women and girls. It's their right to exclude biological men. But if we follow this to its logical conclusions, the same rulings, the same findings would be applied to physical places where you can't keep biological men out of women's change rooms and the like.
Well, that's exactly right. And I'm sure your viewers remember, Chris, a few years ago, I introduced a bill to the Australian Senate, the Save Women's Sports Bill, which went to this exact issue, that, you know, went to the fact that we knew that women's sports were under threat, that women and girls didn't have the right to single-sex sports because we had bodies like Sport Australia and the Australian Olympic Committee and all of these sporting organisations saying that inclusion in sport should be on the basis of gender identity rather than sex. And that's why I introduced a piece of legislation to say, well, hold up here, common sense says that women and girls have had this right for decades and decades and decades, and they should continue to have that right. But unfortunately, because the Sex Discrimination Act was amended back in 2013 to include gender identity as a protected attribute, that right that women and girls once had to their own spaces and their own services is no longer absolute.
It's a shocker. When you mention sport, though, there are signs that Olympic sports at Olympic levels are going to get serious about making sure that the women competing in women's events are in fact women, and they'll have to do a test once only, but actually have to test their womanhood.
Well, that's exactly right. And I mean, again, I've come on your program before, Chris, talking about World Rugby, which all the way back in 2020 came up with the research and the evidence that demonstrates that women are at a much greater risk of injury on the playing field if they're playing against biological men. All of these global sporting organisations have come to the realisation that it's not safe or fair to expect women to compete against biological males in sport. But our Australian sporting organisations have been completely silent on this issue. So there's some real leadership that's required here. And, you know, I hope that the Tickle versus Giggle case might move the dial on some of these issues once again. But we're still a long way off being in a situation in Australia where women and girls have the right to access single-sex services and single-sex spaces and single-sex sports.
Look, Claire, you've been such a strong advocate on these issues. Surely 90% of the country is behind you, yet still, as you say, not enough action from Australian groups. So all power to your arm, and thanks for joining us again. Claire Chandler there, the Liberal Senator for Tasmania, who really is working hard on these things. You think that it's just so logical, it's so important.